Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize you were dead wrong? Picture this: a wealthy man fires his maid for a mistake she didn't even make, but hours later, he's begging her to stay when he sees her risking everything to save his kid. This is a story that'll hit you right in the gut. It's about snap judgments, hidden heroes, and the kind of redemption that makes you rethink how you treat people. Stick with me, because by the end, you'll be questioning every assumption you've ever made. We're diving into a tale that's as real as it gets, packed with lessons that'll stick with you long after this video ends. You're about to meet a woman whose courage will blow your mind and a man whose world gets turned upside down. Ready? Let's go. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in a neighborhood so fancy the houses practically had their own zip codes. The lawns were manicured, the driveways gleamed with luxury cars, and the air smelled like money. Michael Carter, a big-shot lawyer with a corner office and a temper shorter than a matchstick in a windstorm, was having a terrible day. His coffee was cold, his biggest client had just lost $1 million case, and his 6-year-old son, Ethan, was throwing a full-on tantrum over a missing toy car. Michael was the kind of guy who thought money could fix anything, except maybe his patience, which was running thinner than a paper towel. Sarah Thompson, the maid, was the heart of the Carter household, even if Michael didn't see it. She'd been with them for 3 years, keeping their sprawling mansion so clean you could eat off the floors. Her cooking? Let's just say her lasagna could make a grown man cry tears of joy. Sarah was in her late 30s, a single mom raising a teenage daughter named Maya, and she poured every ounce of her soul into her work. She had a smile that could light up the darkest room, but to Michael, she was just the help. He barely knew her name, let alone her story. All he saw was a black woman, quiet and efficient, who was always there when he needed his shirts ironed or his coffee poured. That morning, Michael was in a mood to burn bridges. He stormed into the kitchen, where Sarah was scrubbing a pan with the focus of a surgeon. "Where's my Rolex?" he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It was on my dresser last night, and now it's gone." Sarah froze, her hands still soapy, her heart starting to race. "I didn't touch it, Mr. Carter," she said calmly. "I only cleaned the floors today." But Michael wasn't in the mood for explanations. His face was red, veins popping like they were auditioning for a horror movie. "You're the only one who's been in there. Don't lie to me." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd never stolen a thing in her life, not a penny, not a paperclip. But she knew how this looked. A missing watch, a rich boss with a chip on his shoulder, and her, the black maid who scraped by to keep her daughter in school. She tried to speak, to explain she'd never even been near his bedroom that day, but Michael cut her off like a guillotine. "You're done. Pack your stuff and get out. I don't trust you anymore." Just like that, 3 years of loyalty, of early mornings and late nights, were tossed out like yesterday's garbage. Sarah's eyes stung with tears, but she held her head high, grabbed her worn-out bag, and walked out the door, her heart heavy but her dignity intact. The walk down the driveway felt like a mile. Sarah's mind was spinning. She thought about Maya, her 16-year-old daughter, who was counting on her to pay for those SAT prep classes. She thought about the bills piling up on her kitchen table, the rent that was due next week. She'd given the Carters everything, and now she was out of a job for something she didn't do. It wasn't just the money, it was the sting of being accused, of being seen as less than. But Sarah wasn't one to wallow. She squared her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and started walking toward the bus stop, determined to figure out her next move. Meanwhile, Michael was already moving on. He grabbed his phone, called his security guy, and told him to change the locks. "Can't trust anyone these days," he muttered, convinced he'd done the right thing. He didn't give Sarah another thought. His world was back to normal, or so he thought. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you're busy swinging at the wrong pitch. You'd think firing someone would be the end of the story, but the universe had other plans. Back at the Carter mansion, Ethan was still obsessing over his missing toy car. It was a little red Mustang, his favorite, the one he'd driven across the living room floor 1,000,000 times. The kid was as stubborn as his dad, with a fire in his belly that wouldn't quit. While Michael was on a heated call with a client, yelling about contracts and deadlines, Ethan decided he'd had enough of waiting for someone to find his car. He slipped out the back door, quiet as a mouse, and headed for the sprawling backyard. The Carter's backyard was like something out of a magazine. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a stone fountain that cost more than most people's cars, and a massive oak tree that looked like it had been there since the dinosaurs. But next to that tree was the real danger, a deep, murky pond that stretched 8 feet down, with a muddy bottom that could grab you like quicksand. Michael and his wife, Laura, had told Ethan 1,000 times to stay away from it. "It's not a pool, buddy," Laura would say. "It's dangerous." But 6-year-olds don't always listen, especially when they're on a mission. Ethan spotted his toy car near the pond's edge, half buried in the dirt where he'd left it during a game of car chase the day before. His eyes lit up, and he ran over, his sneakers slipping on the grass. He reached for the car, stretching just a little too far, and, yep, you saw this coming, he slipped right into the water. The pond was cold, dark, and way over his head. Ethan thrashed, his little arms flailing, his voice choking as he tried to scream. He couldn't swim, and the muddy bottom was pulling at his legs like it wanted to keep him. He was sinking, and fast. Inside the house, Michael was still on his call, pacing his office like a caged lion. The nanny, who was supposed to keep an eye on Ethan, was on her lunch break, scrolling through her phone in the kitchen. The gardener wasn't due for another hour, and Laura was at a meeting across town. It was the perfect storm of bad timing, the kind of moment where seconds feel like years. Ethan was alone, fighting for his life, and no one in the house had a clue. The pond wasn't just deep, it was a death trap. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, drowning is the leading cause of death for kids aged 1 to 4, and even older kids like Ethan are at risk if they can't swim. Every year, about 4,000 people drown in the U.S. And most of those tragedies happen in places like backyard pools or ponds. Ethan didn't know how to swim yet. Michael had been meaning to sign him up for lessons but kept putting it off. Now, his son was paying the price for that procrastination, and the clock was ticking louder than ever. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that'll give you chills. Sarah was still walking down the street, her bag slung over her shoulder, her mind a whirlwind of hurt and worry. She could have kept going, caught the bus, and left the Carters in her rearview mirror. Who would have blamed her? She'd been humiliated, accused of stealing, and kicked out like she was nothing. Most people would have washed their hands of the whole mess and never looked back. But Sarah wasn't most people. She had a heart bigger than the mansion she'd just been fired from, and a sixth sense for trouble that only a mom could understand. As she passed the Carters' backyard fence, she heard something. A faint splash, followed by a cry that cut through the air like a knife. It was the kind of sound that stops you in your tracks, the kind that makes your blood run cold. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dropped her bag, her wallet and keys spilling onto the sidewalk, and sprinted toward the sound. The fence was tall, at least 6 feet, but Sarah didn't care. She grabbed the wooden slats, hoisted herself up in her work apron and worn-out sneakers, and climbed over like she was auditioning for an action movie. When she got to the other side, her worst fear was staring her in the face. Ethan's head was bobbing in the pond, his hands clawing at the water, his cries growing weaker. The kid was drowning, and there was no one else around. Sarah didn't stop to think about the cold water or the danger. She kicked off her shoes, took a deep breath, and dove in. The pond was freezing, the kind of cold that shocks your lungs and makes your muscles scream. The muddy bottom grabbed at her legs like it was alive, trying to pull her down too. But Sarah was a fighter, always had been. She swam to Ethan, her stroke strong and steady, and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him up to the surface. They broke through the water, both gasping for air. Ethan was coughing, crying, clinging to Sarah like she was his lifeline. She held him tight, kicking her legs to keep them afloat, and swam to the shore. By the time they reached the grass, Ethan was shivering but breathing, his little chest heaving as he coughed up water. Sarah checked him over, her hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline, making sure he was okay. She didn't notice Michael running out of the house, his phone still in his hand, his face white as a sheet. He'd heard the commotion from his office window and thought it was just neighborhood kids messing around. Then he saw Sarah, soaking wet, cradling his son, and his entire world turned upside down. Sarah's clothes were dripping, her hair plastered to her face, but she was calm, focused, talking to Ethan in a soft voice. "You're okay, sweetie. Just breathe, I've got you." Ethan nodded, his eyes wide, still gripping her arm. Michael stumbled over, dropping to his knees beside them. "Ethan. Oh my God, are you okay?" he stammered, his voice cracking like glass. Ethan nodded, still clinging to Sarah. Michael looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 3 years. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was the woman who'd saved his son's life. Michael was frozen, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. There was Sarah, the woman he'd fired just hours ago, soaking wet and shivering, holding his son like he was her own. The same woman he'd accused of stealing his Rolex, insulted, and sent packing without a second thought. His throat tightened, guilt hitting him like a tidal wave. "Sarah, I don't know what to say," he started, but the words felt small, useless. Sarah just shook her head, her voice steady despite the cold. "He's okay. That's what matters." But there was a fire in her eyes, a quiet strength that told Michael she wasn't letting him off the hook. She'd saved his son, but she wasn't about to forget how he'd treated her. Michael helped her up, his hands trembling, and they brought Ethan inside. They wrapped him in blankets, cranked up the heat, and called a doctor to make sure he was fine. The whole time, Michael was replaying the morning in his head, every harsh word, every assumption, every moment he'd looked at Sarah and seen only the help instead of a person. The doctor arrived within the hour, a kind older man who checked Ethan's vitals and gave him a clean bill of health. "He's lucky," the doctor said. "A few more minutes in that water, and things could have been very different." Michael nodded, his stomach twisting. He couldn't stop looking at Sarah, who was sitting on the couch, still in her wet clothes, sipping a cup of tea Laura had made her. Laura, who'd rushed home after Michael's frantic call, was in tears, hugging Sarah like she was family. "Thank you," Laura kept saying, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving my baby." Once the doctor left, Michael pulled Sarah aside. They stood in the hallway, away from the chaos of the living room. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so wrong about you. I'm sorry." Sarah didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face, letting his words hang in the air like a storm cloud. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but sharp. "You didn't trust me, Mr. Carter. You didn't even ask. You just assumed." Those words cut deeper than any shout could have. Michael nodded, his face burning with shame. "I know. And I don't know how to make this right." Sarah didn't let him off easy. "I've worked for you for 3 years," she said. "I've cleaned your house, cooked your meals, watched your son grow up. And you didn't know a thing about me. You didn't care to." Michael winced, because she was right. He'd never asked about her life, her daughter, her dreams. He'd never seen her as anything more than a role. But now, standing there, he saw her for who she was, a woman with more courage, more heart, than he could ever hope to have. Let's pause the story for a second, because this isn't just about a dramatic rescue or a guilty dad. It's about something we all do, whether we want to admit it or not. We judge people based on what we think we know. Michael saw Sarah as the maid, a one-dimensional figure who existed to serve his family. He let his biases, about her job, her race, her place in his world, cloud his judgment. And he's not alone. We all do it. That guy on the bus with the ripped jacket? We assume he's trouble. The cashier who's moving too slow? We roll our eyes and think they're lazy. But we don't know their stories, and that's where we go wrong. Science backs this up. A 2018 study from Princeton University found that we form impressions of people in just 100 milliseconds, faster than you can snap your fingers. That's how quick our brains are to slap a label on someone. But here's the problem, those snap judgments are often dead wrong. A 2020 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology showed that first impressions based on stereotypes, like assuming someone's dishonest because of their job or background, are accurate less than 30% of the time. That means we're wrong about people 7 times out of 10. 7. Michael's story is a textbook case. He assumed Sarah was a thief because she was the maid, the outsider, in his fancy house. He didn't stop to think about her character, her loyalty, the fact that she'd been with his family for 3 years without a single complaint. He saw her through a lens of bias, and it almost cost him everything. Because let's be real, if Sarah hadn't been there, if she hadn't heard Ethan's cry, this story could have ended in tragedy. But it's not just about Michael. We've all been there. Maybe you've crossed the street to avoid someone who looked sketchy, only to realize later they were just having a bad day. Or maybe you've dismissed a coworker because they didn't talk the way you expected, only to find out they're brilliant at their job. These judgments aren't just mistakes, they can hurt people. A 2022 Pew Research Center survey found that 60% of Americans have made a snap judgment about someone they later regretted. That's more than half of us, carrying around the weight of being wrong. In workplaces, it's even worse. A 2019 study from the Society for Human Resource Management showed that 76% of employees who felt stereotyped or undervalued were less likely to stay in their jobs. That's 3 out of 4 people, walking away because they weren't seen for who they are. Sarah could have been one of them. She could have taken Michael's firing and never looked back. But she didn't, and that's what makes her the hero of this story. Back to Michael and Sarah. After the doctor left, the house was quiet, but the air was thick with emotion. Ethan was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, clutching his toy car like it was his lifeline. Laura was still hovering, checking on him every 5 minutes. Michael, though, was a mess. His tie was crooked, his hair looked like he'd run his hands through it 100 times, and his eyes were red from holding back tears. He sat Sarah down in the living room, away from the chaos, and tried to find the words to fix what he'd broken. "Sarah, I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice shaking. "You saved my son's life. I fired you for no reason, and you still," he trailed off, choking up. Sarah, still in her damp clothes, just nodded. She wasn't one for big speeches, but she had something to say. "Mr. Carter, I've worked for you for 3 years. I've seen Ethan grow up, from a toddler who could barely walk to a kid who won't stop talking about cars. I care about him. I wasn't going to let him drown, no matter what you think of me." Those words hit Michael like a punch to the chest. He realized he'd never really seen Sarah, not as a person, anyway. She was just a shadow in his house, someone who cleaned and cooked and disappeared when her shift was over. But now, he saw her strength, her courage, her heart. He saw the woman who'd climbed a fence and dove into a freezing pond without a second thought. "I want you to come back," he said. "Please. With a raise. And I promise things will be different." Sarah didn't jump at the offer. She leaned back, her arms crossed, and looked at him like she was sizing up his soul. "I need to think about it," she said. "I need to know you trust me. Because if you don't, this won't work." Michael nodded, knowing she was right. He'd broken something that couldn't be fixed with a paycheck or an apology. Trust takes time, and he'd have to earn it. Over the next few weeks, Michael went all in on making things right. He found his Rolex, by the way. It had slipped behind his dresser, right where he'd left it after a late night at the office. He felt like an idiot, but he owned it. He called a meeting with the household staff, nanny, gardener, everyone, and gave Sarah a formal apology in front of them all. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I accused Sarah of something she didn't do, and I judged her without knowing her. That's on me." The room was silent, but Sarah gave him a small nod, a sign she appreciated the effort. Michael didn't stop there. He started asking Sarah about her life, something he'd never done before. He learned about Maya, her 16-year-old daughter who dreamed of becoming a doctor. He learned about the second job Sarah worked at a diner on weekends, just to cover Maya's school fees. He learned about the way Sarah stayed up late helping Maya with homework, even when she was exhausted from cleaning houses. It hit him hard. Sarah wasn't just a maid. She was a mom, a dreamer, a fighter. To show he meant business, Michael set up a college fund for Maya. Not as a bribe, but as a way to say, "I see you. I value you." He didn't tell Sarah until the paperwork was done, and when he did, she cried, not because of the money, but because someone finally saw her as more than the help. Sarah did come back to work, but things were different. Michael treated her with respect, not just as an employee, but as a person who'd saved his family. He even started checking his biases, signing up for a diversity training program at his law firm, not because his boss made him, but because he wanted to be better. This story isn't just about a maid and a lawyer. It's about all of us. We live in a world where it's so easy to put people in boxes: rich, poor, black, white, boss, worker. Those boxes make life simple, but they blind us to the truth. Sarah wasn't just a maid, she was a mom, a hero, a woman with more courage than most of us could ever hope to have. Michael wasn't just a jerk, he was a dad who loved his son but let his ego and biases get in the way. The numbers don't lie. That 2022 Pew Research Center survey I mentioned earlier? It found that 60% of Americans have regretted a snap judgment they made about someone. That's more than half of us, carrying around the weight of being wrong. And in workplaces, where stories like Sarah's happen every day, the 2019 Society for Human Resource Management study showed that 76% of employees who feel stereotyped or undervalued are less likely to stick around. That's a lot of talent lost because we're too quick to judge. But there's hope. Michael's story shows us we can change. He went from firing Sarah to seeing her as family. He took a hard look at himself, owned his mistakes, and did the work to be better. And that's the real lesson here: it's never too late to question your assumptions and do right by the people around you. Whether it's at work, with your neighbors, or with a stranger on the street, taking a second to see someone for who they are can change everything. So, what's the big takeaway? Don't judge a book by its cover, because you might miss the best story of your life. Sarah's courage and Michael's redemption show us that people are so much more than what we see at first glance. They're heroes in disguise, waiting for a chance to shine. This story started with a firing and ended with a rescue, but the real change happened in Michael's heart, and maybe in yours, too. Next time you're tempted to write someone off, think of Sarah. Think of the pond, the kid, the moment that could have been lost if she'd walked away. Then ask yourself, who am I not seeing? Who's the hero I'm missing? Let's make a promise to look a little closer, to listen a little harder, and to give people the chance they deserve. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me, smash that subscribe button. It's right there, ready to keep you hooked on more real-life stories that'll make you think twice.